When I was in college, I worked the night shift one summer vacation. I was 19 years old and an average-looking female. I wasn't enthused about having to work a job over the summer, but it was the only way I was going to be able to afford tuition. Working the night shift at the McDonald's drive-thru was probably the weirdest experience of my life. I still remember my first night on the job. A lady came in and was talking to someone while she was waiting for us to take her order. She sounded extremely upset and was screaming at the top of her lungs. It seemed like she was directing her anger at someone in the back seat. Assuming she was abusing her children, being a psychology major, I naturally pick up on such things. Surprisingly, she ordered 3 Big Macs and 3 large Cokes. It turned out my intuition was wrong. When she pulled up to pay for her meal, she was completely alone. I was honestly startled by this. Why would she be yelling and ordering so much food if she was alone? I couldn't understand the situation. Despite her behavior, she was otherwise polite. She spoke to me nicely, paid for her food, and left, even wishing me a good night. She had been the only customer we had in a 45-minute window. After she left, I noticed some of my coworkers laughing at me. Curious, I asked them what was so funny. They informed me that it was my first encounter with Schizo Susan. Apparently, she regularly behaved like that, showing up at all hours of the night to order excessive amounts of food. She would yell at people in her car, even though there was never anyone actually in her car. Since they didn't know her real name, they started calling her Schizo Susan. Sometimes she was the only customer to come through the drive-thru all night. It unnerved me greatly. About a week went by with her coming in every night, just as my coworkers had described. Between ordering and picking up her food, she would always be yelling at someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. So, I formulated a plan. I decided to ask her who she was speaking to, pretending as if she was talking to me. It was the best approach I could think of without seeming abrasive. On a Friday night, I finally gathered the courage to do it. I had chickened out a couple of times before, but since I didn't work weekends, I thought it was now or never to try something new on my last shift of the week. When I attempted it, I listened into her screaming for a few more seconds than usual. Through the McDonald's speaker, I could hear what people were saying without them knowing I was listening. It was against the rules, but I did it anyway. I listened for about 20 or 30 seconds and heard her yelling at someone named Darian. Just as she was in the middle of saying something, I interrupted her and asked, "I'm sorry, ma'am, were you speaking to me?" She simply replied, "No." Disappointed, I knew I had to try another approach. I asked her if Darian would also be ordering. She went silent. It wasn't a whole minute, but she didn't say anything. After asking her twice if she was still there, she let out a banshee scream. It was the loudest thing I've ever heard, and it hurt my ears. The McDonald's microphone system was already loud, but her scream was unbearable. I was scared for my life in that moment and worried I would lose my job. I felt guilty, as if I had caused her outburst. In hindsight, I don't think I did anything terrible. I simply asked if the person she had been screaming about would be ordering food as well. Her scream didn't contain any words, it was just a violent and guttural noise. I was taken aback and didn't know how to respond. I asked her if she wanted to continue placing her order, but instead, she drove away. She accelerated much faster than she should have, and as she passed by, I caught a glimpse of her face through the window. In that split second, I saw that she looked extremely distressed. To make things even stranger, the microphone system stopped working correctly for the rest of the night. I think her scream had been loud enough to break something in it. That was, without a doubt, the weirdest thing that happened to me during any job I've ever worked. After that incident, this strange lady disappeared. She never came back to McDonald's. I asked my coworkers how long she had been coming for her nightly visits, and they said it was for as long as they could remember, likely at least a year. I felt guilty for upsetting her so much, but it's clear that she likely needed serious mental help. It has been a long time since I worked at McDonald's, and I have no plans to work in fast food again. I can only hope that wherever that lady ended up, she received the help she desperately needed. I worked at a museum a couple of years back, maybe a decade ago now. I was a night shift security guard. It was as boring as you could imagine, but I desperately needed the money, and it paid a few dollars more than any other job I could land, so I figured why not. I remember landing a construction job a year into working this night shift security job. I enjoyed construction a lot more, and I desperately needed to get my life back on track. Being on the night shift really messed with my mood and general well-being. The construction job I got had roughly the same pay, so it was a no-brainer even if I had to do a little bit more manual labor. As much as I disliked the job itself, I really liked all of the people that worked at that museum. They were actually really cool. I went ahead and gave them my 2 weeks' notice and told them that I would stick around for as long as they needed me to find a replacement. They hired some skinny pale guy named Justin. When I first met him, he seemed like he was a decent enough guy. After all, it really wasn't my problem once I left. After a couple of shifts with him, though, I noticed that he was an extremely awkward and very strange person. He did this thing where he would change the tone of his voice mid-sentence. It was really strange, and it almost made me feel like he had some kind of mental issue. Trust me, I wasn't being judgmental or anything, and if you heard it yourself, you would probably have had the same concern. Not that I thought that he was dangerous or anything, just a little out there with a possible mental illness, maybe even a speech impediment. Anyway, it was my 3rd or 4th shift training him, and it was an ordinary night just like any other. As weird as he may have been, he seemed somewhat depressed or sad. I caught on pretty easily as he did not make much of an effort to conceal it. We were making the usual trip throughout the entire museum, which was honestly a pretty long walk. We were probably about 10 minutes into it when I finally just asked him why he seemed so sad. He told me that he was really lonely and couldn't get a girlfriend. Again, if you had one look at this guy, you would understand why he couldn't get a girlfriend, let alone his very weird personality. I tried telling him that there were plenty of fish in the sea and that he could probably have some luck on the internet. Online dating wasn't as big back then. He kind of shrugged his shoulders and just continued being sad. I didn't know what else I could tell him. After that point, he gradually became weirder and weirder with each passing night. It was really strange. For instance, he would start going on these massive monologues about the most random things in the world. I only had to stay for a couple more shifts, but it honestly became really intolerable being around this guy. There was one night where he talked for at least 15 entire minutes about the environmental harm of pizza crust. Yes, literally pizza crust. It made absolutely no sense in the world. I tried interrupting him a couple of times to ask what was up, but he just cut me off and even started ignoring me after a certain point. When you are completely alone in a massive building with one other person, trust me when I say that their mental well-being is very important. I gradually began feeling more and more unsafe in the presence of this weird guy. Justin seemed like he was going crazy or something. Thankfully, my last shift with him went by decently enough. It was still awkward and moderately unbearable, but it was at least over. I started my new job, and everything seemed to be going really well. I had completely forgotten about Justin, and life seemed to move on. I didn't really think about that security job anymore at all. That was until I heard an interesting story from my friend a few months later. I still kept in touch with a few people from the museum who worked there during the day. We were only Facebook friends, but that was enough for me. One of them messaged me to ask me what I thought about the guy that replaced me, Justin. I was honest with her and told her that I thought Justin was a really strange guy and possibly insane or something. She typed back, "You're going to love this story then." She then proceeded to tell me about Justin being fired for completely destroying an entire exhibit on the night shift. I guess they came in for the morning shift and found him trying to put it back together. They watched the security footage, and this guy literally tried fighting a dinosaur skeleton. I guess he had been acting really weird that night, judging by what she told me about the rest of the security footage. But the interesting part of the story is that they somehow found out he was on antipsychotic medication. They figured that he had stopped taking his medication. That was all my friend knew. And that's all I know. It's really scary how people can just stop taking their very necessary medication on a whim and then have a complete mental breakdown. I started wondering if he had been off his meds when I met him. All I know is that I'm kind of happy I don't ever have to see Justin again. I work at a regional grocery store. I am a 26-year-old female. I graduated from college with a master's degree in psychology and still couldn't find a job. Due to family circumstances, I wasn't able to get my PhD, which was basically the bare minimum to land any decent paying job. So, I was a little stuck. I even had a hard time finding a regular job. I had applied to a bunch of lower positions, but I kept getting rejected because I was overqualified. Over and over again, people told me that I would get too bored on the job, and so they wouldn't hire me. This really pissed me off. After a certain point, my student loan payments were due, and I really needed the money. I had to ask my cousin's friend for a job. He was the manager at this regional grocery store. Literally, the only position they had available was stocking shelves on night shift. I couldn't believe myself. I was so ashamed. I felt like I'd wasted years of my life and thousands of dollars in debt just to get a job anyone can do. Anyway, the job itself wasn't all that bad. I was allowed to listen to my earbuds while I worked. This meant I could turn on my favorite podcast while working. My favorite murder, if you're wondering. I must have worked there for about a year before the big change came. Previously, the store closed down at 12 in the morning. But, for whatever reason, that policy got changed and it became a 24-hour store with the exception of holidays and Sunday nights. It really sucked. What used to be my podcast and stock the shelves time kept getting interrupted by stupid customers asking where things were. That was fine, I didn't mind helping people out. I worked there after all. But they would literally ask me where the most obvious grocery items were. So many times, I couldn't help but think, are you blind or stupid? But then there was one night when a very strange man came up to me. He had really buggy eyes. His entire body was round. And he had the longest nose hair I've ever seen on a human being. It was like he took the hair right off his head and glued it into his nose. I was down on my knees stocking the bottom shelf with pickles when he touched my hair. I had my hair in a ponytail that night, and he lightly caressed the part of it that was touching my back. I jerked back and asked him, "What the hell?" He tried playing it off like he had arthritis, but I knew that he was just being a creep. I asked him what he wanted. He stood there for a second, seeming to think about what to say. But only one word came out of his mouth. "You." He walked up closer to me and then started to smell my shoulder. It felt so weird, and I don't think I could have been more creeped out. I told him that if he didn't need any help finding any items, I had work I had to be doing. But he kept standing there. He started smiling really wide and then hugged me. "It's okay, darling. I'm going to take care of you." At this point, I was screaming inside my own head. This freak was crossing a million different lines. I pushed him off me and ran to get my manager, who was a larger guy. He'd have no problem fighting this creep if it came to it. The creepy guy followed me as I went too. The nerve on this guy. When he saw my manager down the aisle, he must have had second thoughts because he turned around and started running away. I explained to my manager everything that had happened, and he said he'd take care of it if that guy came back again. The creep was smart because he waited a couple of weeks before he came back. He waited long enough that the incident would not be on the tip of anyone's mind. I wasn't expecting him, and neither was my manager. I was standing there stocking a shelf like I always did, and all of a sudden, I felt someone tugging my hair. They tugged really hard, and it really hurt my neck. They totally overpowered me and started dragging me across the floor. At this point, I hadn't even realized who it was until I looked up to see that man. He must have dragged me a solid 30 feet towards the exit before someone saw what was going on. It wasn't my manager, but it was another one of the girls who worked with me. She was really nice and started screaming like a banshee and running at him. For one reason or another, he decided to run away again. I was really relieved. I couldn't believe that he was just going to walk up to me and start dragging me out of the store by my hair. What kind of sicko does that? It was truly horrifying. This was finally the incident that convinced the store owner that we had to have security if we were going to be open at night. We had a security guard somewhere on the premises after that, and I felt a lot safer. I'm still looking for a job in psychology, and I really hope I can get one soon. I felt like I really needed a break after having gone through all of this.